ذاته المفر ومن إليه يلجأ المضطر ويا قريب العفو يا مولاه ويا مغيث كل ما ودعاه.
بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدي ومولاي رسول الله. أما بعد. So, briefly, the course overview. What exactly is it that we are trying to do in this course, inshallah ta'ala? We're trying to answer one fundamental question, and that is, what does it mean to be a Muslim in the modern world? What does it mean to be a Muslim in the age of doubt? And what is the modern world? What do we mean when we speak of a modern world or a modern age? And in particular, we have two things that we want to try to do, two directions that we will try to move towards. The first is to provide you with a critical introduction to modernity, what we refer to as the modern age. What is modernity? What does it mean to be modern? And what is modernity and what is it not? So is modernity a political system? Is it a certain time period? Is it secularism? Is it science? Is it progress? Is it technology? What does it mean to be modern and what is modernity? Second, and the more important part, is to introduce you to the Islamic Aqidah, not Islamic Aqidah as a science or as a theology, but the Islamic Aqidah, i.e. the Islamic worldview, as a form of critical awareness that can inform our thought and our action in the modern age. So we will look at key concepts and terms such as what is consciousness, right? What are structures? What is metaphysics? What is epistemology? What is morality? And what is identity? So the course objectives that you have are identical to the course overview. The course structure, inshallah, consists of 5 sections, 5 modules. The first refers to our situation. How do we situate ourselves in the modern world, and what exactly is at stake? What exactly is the problem that we are trying to address, and what is the nature of this problem? And the second module, we will try to provide a framework for thinking. So basically, when we want to think about Islam and modernity, where do we begin? What is the basis for thought? Module 3, we then use this framework to try to understand the genealogy of modernity and the secular. Where did it all begin? How did it begin? Why? And basically, what are its foundations? Again, by age of doubt here, we mean modernity and the secular age. In Module 4, we then use the same framework to ask questions about Islam. So, what is the role of Islam in the modern world? What is an Islamic metaphysics? What is an Islamic epistemology? And what is the position that Muslims ought to adopt towards the modern age? And that is why we have referred to this as Tawheed, as critical awareness. So Tawheed, or the Islamic Aqidah, as a mode of awareness, and Islam as a mode of liberation vis-a-vis or via this, so vis-a-vis or in the face of this modern age. And then Module 5, we will look at Tawheed and we will apply it to modernity. In what ways does Islam challenge the assumptions of the modern world? And in what ways does our worldview, does the Islamic worldview pose certain challenges to the so-called secular age? So today, briefly, very briefly, we just want to talk a bit about the situation that we find ourselves in. And we can begin with a question, I think, that it seems to be a commonsensical and a very basic question, and yet it continues to perplex even the most so-called expert, even the so-called experts and scholars of the field and whatnot. That is the question of what is Islam? When we speak of Islam, what exactly is it that we are referring to? And so are we speaking about a religion? Are we talking about an ideology? Are we speaking of an ethnicity? Is it a culture? Is it a tradition? So what exactly is Islam? So what do you guys think when we use this word Islam and we are somewhat speaking in a modern language? What labels come to mind for you, or categories do you think of when I say Islam? What is Islam for you guys? Yeah, sisters. Religion. Okay. Amr.
I would say it's complete way of life.
Complete way of life. Mhm. Our honorary guest, what would you say if we say Islam or Christianity?
I also think that there is. I also think Islam is a religion.
Islam is a religion. Okay. So, I mean, obviously, part of this course is kind of be able to try to define Islam on its own grounds, right? Try to define Islam via Islam and whatnot, and then try to articulate the proper language and basis through which we can understand what Islam is and what Islam is not. And one of the things that we will explore is just how problematic it is when we frame Islam as being a religion. When we frame Islam as being a religion. And when we find that the Arabic word deen does not correspond to the word religion, and that the word religion is very much a product of a modern narrative and a modern discourse that privatizes Islam, and then thus when we use the word religion, we have already marginalized Islam before the battle has even begun to define Islam. And so we will look at the importance of the language that we choose. But inshallah ta'ala, this will come. And then the question of what is modernity. Now, when we think about the modern age, generally what we think of a certain time period of progress or science and technology and whatnot. Sometimes when we think of modernity, we think of a political system. We think of a political system. تفضل أخي. وعليكم السلام. So we said in the same way we asked what is Islam, then we also asked the question, okay, then what is modernity, right? What does it mean to be modern? The popular narrative has it that modernity refers to a certain time period, or modernity refers to progress or science. Modernity refers to a certain set of political system based on certain individual self-evident rights and so forth. So this is one of the things that we want to unpack as well, inshallah. What is it exactly when we speak of modernity? Is it a time period? Is it a religion on its own? Does it refer to science, scientific progress? Does it refer to governance or economic system and so forth? Now, we'll go back to the first question. What exactly is Islam? Or on the slide, who's Islam? So, one of the reasons that this is actually a relevant question, who is Islam, is because there's this increasing disposition, this increasing characteristic among young Muslims to identify with Islam as being, the proper name through which they identify themselves. And so there's a very interesting book that it came out recently. It's actually a marketing book. And what I found very interesting, the title of the book is called Generation M, referring to M as in Muslims. And essentially what they were trying to do is they were trying to argue that there is a new market of consumers around the world, a new global consumer market, essentially being young Muslims who identify with this sense of Muslimness, the sense of Islam as being the primary identity, Islam as being the master signifier. By signifier, we mean the ways in which you identify yourself. So I can identify myself through the name Ali. I can identify myself through my position, my occupation, the city I was born in, or I can choose to identify with Islam. And the priority that I give to these different signifiers is what determines what is my master signifier. So there is this debate now about what exactly does it mean to be a Muslim and what exactly is Islam. What is this name that people are going into the streets for, and that people are trying to debate over, and that people have been writing about, and that youth, regardless of their nationality and their social status and whatnot, are increasingly identifying with. In other words, what exactly is behind the name Islam. And to discuss this, we have to understand something important, that when we talk about what is in a name, we're not the name here, any name does not refer to a label. A name is something far more than a label. And in Salman Syed's he has a wonderful book called Recalling the Caliphate, and in the first chapter on the names, he kind of brings out what exactly is at stake. He says, a name is not only a shorthand expression of something that already exists, but more profoundly, it is to the process of naming that the thing being referred to enters into our consciousness. In other words, by which heterogeneous elements are marshaled together to become intrinsic features of the named entity. It is a process, it is an act of becoming. So when we use a name, we are not just merely attaching a label to a person or to a nation. When we use a name, we are essentially enacting something. We are bringing something forth. We are bringing something into being and whatnot. So the question fundamentally, when we ask what is behind a name, we are not referring to the label in terms of the letters ISLAM or MUSLIAM. We are referring to the meaning behind this name, the meaning which becomes attached to those who adopted, Muslims and so forth. And it's so clearly what's at stake is not merely a label, right? What's at stake is not merely a label or a set of letters or words. What's at stake behind defining the name is nothing short of existential. And it is existential because the debate is no longer a debate about what does it mean to be a Muslim woman or a Muslim American or a Muslim heterosexual. The question is now far more fundamental, the question that is being debated today. The question is, what does it mean to be Muslim in the very first place? What is Islam? This is the question. And when we say that something is existential, this means that it is a matter of life and death. And our existential crisis, that of the Ummah, or death of the Ummah, when we say that is an existential threat, existential question, this does not mean that Muslims will vanish biologically, that we will simply cease to exist. But the idea is that the Ummah, which is defined by Islam, will vanish and cease to exist, because it is through Islam that we exist as an Ummah, as opposed to a group of aggregate individuals. Now, what makes the question all the more pressing and existential is that this is not being asked in a time of neutrality and a time of stability in the Muslim world, or in a time of ease and intellectual superiority and revival, renaissance, whatever you would like to refer to it. The question is being asked in a time and age in which the whole world has been divided between a hegemonic dominant West and the non-West. And the Ummah is subjugated, it is subverted to this non-West, to the lower part of the hierarchy. And in this age of a godlike hegemony, where the West has become a sort of new god and new ideological hegemon, political, militarily, and so forth, the question is being posed in a space that is not neutral, but that is increasingly violent. And by violent, we mean militarily and intellectually. And why is this Muslim question central for the West? Why is the West so invested in this question? If we live in a supposedly secular age, why is it, for example, that the question of Islam is posed, what is Islam? Whereas, for example, the question of Buddhism, Hinduism is very much a marginal and academic question. It is precisely because Islam does not neatly fit into the narrative of modernity. Islam seems to be immune to secularization. It seems to be immune to being privatized. And it continuously poses a threat to this Western hegemon by threatening to decenter the West. So to understand just how critical the question is behind what is Islam, Salman Syed explains beautifully. He says, the act of naming is an exercise in history making. Only those with names can write their own history. Only those with names can give themselves a destiny. Thus, the division of the world between the named West and the nameless non-West becomes a division between people who have their own history and those who do not. Muslims become a people without a history, thus ceasing even to be a people, meaning ceasing to exist. People without history, not because they lack a past, certainly we have a past, but because paradoxically we cannot narrate ourselves or we cannot narrate Islam into the future. Now, this problem is not just a moral problem, right? We're not just talking about an intellectual problem, but this is also a strategic problem. This is also very much a political problem that has concrete implications. And one of the maxims or the golden rules of history, of international order and history, international relations, is that the saying goes that as far as this world is concerned, strategically speaking, eligible states and nations that fail to attain their worthy status are predictably punished. In other words, even from a strategic perspective, not just from a moral perspective, but any nation or group of people who are not able to project themselves onto the world, into world politics, will be punished. And by here, what is meant by punished in terms of international order is that they will inevitably be absorbed into another order, or they will be absorbed into the history of the other. Now, moving on to the next point. So what does it mean for us to speak of a future, right? Muslims narrating their own future by dictating their own name, by defining their own name. To understand what it means to shape one's own future and be able to name oneself and designate the content of the name, i.e. Islam, we have to understand what are the conditions of future building, i.e. what are the conditions of what we refer to as agency. There are three conditions for agency. Agency being the capacity to act and to transform one's reality and external world. The first is the independence of thought, or the capacity to reflect. The second is the capacity to act. And three, recognition of responsibility, meaning that you understand your responsibility and your duty, i.e. there is a particular purpose, there is a particular telos, particular direction that guides this thought and that guides these actions. For us, for Muslims, to kind of jump ahead, this paradigm, the agency, our agency is defined by the Quranic paradigm of Estekhlaf. Estekhlaf, which provides an independent basis for thought, i.e. fulfilling the first condition, which is the Tawhidic worldview, the Aqidah, a course of action that is not limited by oppressive structures of thought, i.e. what we deem to be possible and impossible is not limited to us or defined by structures of power and structures of oppression, but rather by our own sharia and by the prophetic method, by the sunnah. And it designates a responsibility that we have towards mankind, which is al-istikhlaf, right? Al-amru bil-ma'ruf wal-nahi an al-munkar. Now, the whole course will focus on this first point, on how do we develop independence of thought? How do we think independently, and how do we liberate our thought as to be able to determine what our actions ought to be and what our responsibilities are, and to be able to think beyond modernity, step outside of modernity, and be able to name Islam as Muslims. one of the obstacles towards doing so, if you go to another slide, when you talk about the independence of thought, is the question of, okay, when we want to think about our future, who defines our horizons? Who defines the boundaries of how far we can think ahead and what we deem to be possible and impossible in our future? And this is what they refer to as political horizons, which is, for Barner, a situation in which dominant forms of representation, i.e. modernity or secularism, and a situation in which dominant forms of representation and contestability frame and limit the terms in which meaning of any social or cultural phenomenon can be understood. So the ways in which, for example, modernity, right, or secularism limit the way we can think about Islam and think about a future of Islam and even think about what it means to live, what it means to be a Muslim, what it means to designate meaning to that name. So in this ongoing battle about what does it mean to who defines our horizons and what is behind the name Islam, we find very interestingly that everybody has taken it upon himself the supposed right to define what is Islam. So European states have taken it upon themselves to set up institutions to define what is Islam. Universities, secular universities, non-profit organizations, government institutions, including the US State Department, the Department of Defense, the European Union, all of these countries, all of these entities, these beings have taken it upon themselves to tell us what is Islam, except Muslims. Muslims are the only ones who find themselves answering this question, if they can answer this question, from the margins. And by the margins here, I mean the periphery. The periphery not just in terms of geography, meaning, the third world, but also in terms of the intellectual periphery. And so this very question, existential question, which pertains to the very soul and heart and mind of the Muslim, what is Islam? Even this question, we find ourselves answering it, but only answering it from the margins, min al-hamish, answering it from a periphery. And it is precisely because we are in a periphery, when we try to engage with this question, we never engage with it on the basis of independent thought. Instead, we are always engaged in a form of apologetics, tabrir. We are always trying to explain what Islam is not what Islam is. So Islam is not violent. Islam is not patriarchal. Islam is not regressive. And so we were always speaking in the negative of what Islam is not. And Islam becomes a theology of basically answering questions, a defensive theology, instead of being a positive philosophy or a positive force to pose critical questions. And in the face of this, you have those who have adopted this apologetic approach, this art of apologetics. And then you have a second camp that has opted for withdrawal, al-i'tizal, and completely withdrawing from these questions, withdrawing from political, economic, social, intellectual questions, and essentially adopting what now we can call neo-traditionalism, or al-madrasa al-taqlidiyya, which basically reduces Islam to a static theology or a science that can be studied only in the madrasa or in the academia and so forth. So Islam basically becomes a historical text which is to be studied and explained by a scholar, and then his notes are passed on to the student, and his student passes it on to his student, and thus an Islam which poses no challenge whatsoever to the modern age, nor does it provide any sort of basis for independence of thought, nor can it even articulate or think of a horizon or a future that is defined by Islam. Now, at least for us, like students at universities or lecturers at university, what we're most inclined towards, or what we are most exposed to, is the strategy of apologetics, right? And that's because if you think about it, whether it's when you're engaging in social media or you're speaking to your friends, where there's always this sense of anxiousness, right? You always feel anxious, this sense of anxiety, you're always uneasy, and we're always quickly apologetic, especially about what vision we might want to pursue. So we're always trying to think in terms of how do we legitimize or how do we justify, be it our very existence or certain values or ideas in Islam, certain ahkam, for example, the hijab and whatnot. And in reality, this anxiety is part of the problem. It's not just an intellectual problem. This anxiety is part of the problem, because this anxiety or this doubt that you face, that you feel when you are engaging with the other, is the first step in preventing or circumventing the independence of thought, your independence of thought, from your ability to think independently and your ability to think of different horizons. And this is a strategy, we refer to the strategy as a strategy of erosion. When you erode something, it's a slow process of chipping away at something. And so this is very, very, very slow, this slow but very, very deadly process of chipping away at the Muslim mind, but not just chipping away at the Muslim mind, but also chipping away at our very will, right? Al-irada, our very confidence, thiqah and whatnot. It's a problem of the nafsiyya, it's not just a problem of the aql. And when you have a lack of will and no independent thought, then it is inevitable that Islam is absorbed into identity-altering structures. Islam becomes absorbed into liberal paradigms, socialist paradigms, and we become lost between different camps of thought and whatnot. And then we find ourselves, instead of being liberal or socialist or Muslim, we find ourselves being none of the three. We find ourselves being nowhere, lost in history without a history. So in this course, the objective of providing this method of thought, looking at Islamic metaphysics, Islamic epistemology, and Islamic morality and whatnot, is not so that we can merely engage our fellow academics and our colleagues, or so that we can sit at the margins and try to explain why Islam is a religion of peace, or Islam is not violent, and so forth, or justify our very existence. The objective, inshallah ta'ala, is to move beyond the margins, right, towards new horizons and new futures, and that is the responsibility that Allah has designated upon us, which is al-Estekhlaf. Estekhlaf as an alternative paradigm, as an alternative way of situating ourselves as Muslims in the modern world and in the future. So that's why the whole content of the course will be on the independence of thought. So next week, what we'll do is we'll begin by looking at what is thought. We're saying that we want to liberate thought. We want to be able to think independently. We want to be able to think as Muslims so that we can name Islam. So what does it mean to think? Right. So we want to begin next week at the most concrete level. Thought at the level of the everyday life. Thought at the level of waking up to splashing water on your face, to turning on your car, moving from the concrete everyday world, which we will refer to as totality, towards metaphysics, which is aqidah, and then bringing it back down to the question of Islam versus secular thought and so forth, inshallah.